In this installment of the newsletter, we will be going over the Employment Situation Report as published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and this would be for September 2017, and it just came out yesterday. They usually publish on the first Friday of the month, depending upon if there's a holiday or whatnot. Sometimes it's postponed a bit. At any rate, it comes out on the first Friday of the month, generally speaking. And the first number that comes to that perks up right to the top of the picture, of course, would be that there were 906,000 new employees added to the labor force this last month in September 2017. And there are two surveys, very briefly. The current population survey is the one we want to focus on because that's where unemployment numbers come from, and it's also probably a better measure. You could argue one way or the other, but we'll be focusing on the current population survey, which reflected 906,000 new employees, which is the best number since November 2013, and goes back several years before we get anywhere near that number. Uh, uh, again, going back historically. But the other survey is called the payroll survey. It's also through the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's also referred to as the current employment statistics. At any rate, that one came in at negative 33,000 for the month, and that was primarily due to problems associated with Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma, the natural disasters over the course, and they came out, of course, in September. So at any rate, we want to focus on the 906,000 added to the labor force this month. So in the monthly employment report, there's the first table that you encounter would be the household data summary table A, and this is one we want to focus on. We'll walk through and just touch upon each of these items. First is the civilian non-institutional population, and these numbers are in thousands, so the growth for the month was 205,000, and that's an estimate coming from the Census Bureau, and they actually do most of the survey work for the Bureau of Labor Statistics and Bureau of Economic Analysis, so they are definitely the survey folks in the system. But at any rate, the civilian non-institutional population, you'll note that for September it was 255,562,000, and of course the entire population would be 325 million. So the people that are counted in the civilian non-institutional population would be all of those people that are 16 years of age and older, that are not counted in the military or in prison or otherwise counted in other institutions. So again, that's the civilian non-institutional population. That's the outer ring, and everything else we're kind of moving in as we speak. So the civilian labor force is the component of the civilian non-institutional population that includes those folks that are employed and those U3 unemployed, meaning the unemployed would be counted as the folks that are not employed, of course, that are actively seeking employment. So again, the labor force would constitute the employed plus the unemployed. So again, the labor force this past month grew by 575,000, an enormous number. And the labor force participation rate, which is arrived at by taking the labor force and dividing it by the non-institutional population, went from 62.9 to 63.1, which is it's actually a very large jump in 1 month, and that's the highest number that we've had since 2013. Next line down would be the employed. Again, that shows the 906,000 that are added for the month. And the line following that would be the employment population ratio. And this is a very important number, or a very important ratio rather, and it's also probably it's one of the ones that, again, that the Federal Reserve System, through the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, they keep a close eye on this. But that's another story that we'll be getting into in another newsletter. We'll be revisiting that as well. But the employment population ratio went from 60.1 to 60.4, and that 60.4 is the highest reading that we've had on the employment population ratio since January 2009. And again, the employment population ratio is equivalent to those that are employed divided by, again, the civilian non-institutional population. So these are the folks that are actually rowing the boat. And that number has been moving upward quickly, obviously, in this past month. The 906,000 added in terms of the employed just really boosted that number quite a bit. The next line down is the unemployed. Again, that's the U3 unemployed, those folks that are not employed but are actively seeking employment, and that dropped by 331,000. So again, the main point to take away from this is that yes, it seems that we're moving into that area where we can't go much lower so far as the unemployment rate is concerned. But the point again is those 331,000 people that left the ranks of the unemployed went directly into the ranks of the employed rather than moving to the sidelines. So again, the unemployment rate went from 4.4% down to 4.2%, and we wouldn't be surprised if that number actually goes up a bit in the ensuing months, after things settle down, after the hurricanes and whatnot, because what would happen would be something that's referred to in economics as the encouraged worker effect, where more people seeing that there are jobs that are available begin to more actively seek employment. So that unemployment rate could go up, or probably will go up over the course of the upcoming months. Lastly would be the not in the labor force portion, which dropped by 368,000. And again, these 368,000s on a net basis effectively went directly into the ranks of the employed, which is a very important point. So again, when you're talking about the not in the labor force, the civilian non-institutional population is broken down between the labor force and those not in the labor force. And anytime we see that movement out of the not in the labor force into the labor force, that is a good thing. So again, this next slide shows an illustration of the way this works, and it's something that you have to kind of take your time and walk through, because it can be a bit confusing, but because there are a lot of in and outs. For example, when you take the employed and you add the unemployed, since you have a negative unemployment number, and to arrive at the labor force, you go from 906,000 employed, subtracting out effectively 331,000 that left the ranks of the unemployed. So you have a lower labor force of 575,000. Likewise, if we look at the CNP, or the civilian non-institutional population, we would subtract out the labor force component to see what the change is in the not in the labor force. So as a result, we had 205,000 subtracting out 575,000 from the labor force to arrive at a negative net 368,000 not in the labor force. So, okay, again, there's a rounding piece of this, of course, that comes into play that we note here as well. So the next piece that we're looking at, the next slide rather, would be the labor force participation rate. And this has been something of concern for quite some time, that we've fallen off so much, and there's been much literature on this, and many fingers tend to point toward the growing size of the folks from the baby boomers born 1946 to 1964 that are moving into the retirement years. But what we've talked about in the past is that the real problem has been with those younger age cohorts, the 16 to 24, the 25 to 34, so on and so forth, going up through age 55, where in the past we've seen their participation rate. Again, labor force participation rate is the labor force, which consists of those folks that are employed plus the unemployed, divided by the overall civilian non-institutional population. And at any rate, those younger cohorts, those younger age groups, have really not been participating to the extent that they had prior to the recession, the Great Recession. So the good news was, in this last month, in September, we saw a move upward in the labor force participation rate to 63.1%. And we still have a long ways to go, but that goes back to September. The last time we had that reading or higher was 63.3% in September of 2013. So again, we are moving in the right direction. Again, this next graph, this next presentation slide depicts that a little easier to see, to visualize that 63.1% labor force participation rate, and the movement going back, starting from September 2013, that moving down, kind of flattening out at the bottom, but staying in the doldrums for several years, obviously, and hopefully this number continues to improve. And again, the labor force component is the employed plus the unemployed. So if we see, presuming or hopefully over the next several months, we'll see improvements in employment, and we will also hopefully have more unemployment in terms of folks that are being encouraged to come back into the labor force, seeking employment. So this last graph that we're showing is probably the most, aside from, or at least in conjunction with, the 906,000 employed, is we're looking at the employment population ratio. And the employment population ratio is you take the employed, divide that by the civilian non-institutional population. So these are the people that are actually out there working, and so this percentage is very important because it shows how many people are actually pulling on the oars, so to speak, within the civilian non-institutional population, which is again the folks that are 16 years of age and older that are not in the military, nor are they in prisons and otherwise institutionalized. So again, the 60.4% number is very important because that's the highest employment population ratio we've had since January of 2009. So this is a remarkable number, and hopefully going forward we'll continue to see this improvement. So again, this is just basically a wrap up this last little bit, and again focusing on the employment population ratio, the importance of that, and looking forward, we want to be sure that the employment numbers continue to rise, and hopefully we'll have a situation where we have more people that are encouraged, and we do have a higher unemployment rate in terms of a temporary situation, and that more folks are moving into the labor force actively seeking employment. And that's it for this newsletter, with the exception, of course, what drives all of this is economic growth, and so we'll have to pay particularly close attention to what happens in terms of GDP going forward.